Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. To be honest, I've kind of been in and out of mental stability, as most of you know, hence why the upload schedule has been so sporadic. So, about the poll as well, half of you enjoy the characters and the other half don't. As I mentioned in the community tab the other day, I'll probably have them on about twice a month though, because some of you still do like it, and it also helps them out, and I try to help out smaller channels the best I can as well. I picked them because I honestly do think that they have some great talent as well. Now, with that said, moving on, we're doing 3 more Cannibal stories this weekend. My channel has obviously been dipping quite a bit, and it really hasn't been helping my mental health as well. I really do need to keep pushing forward and keep making content as well, because I do enjoy it. I really do, but it has been quite hard for me. Finding motivation, or even having time with having a child, has definitely proven difficult. So, thank you all for sticking with me, of who has. I know some people have left the channel because of my upload schedule and or certain videos that I have uploaded, but in all honesty, this is still my channel. I still need to do what makes me happy and find other people who enjoy the same hobby or enjoy the same topics as me as well. But I am very happy for the community that I do have, and that we all have, excuse me. The comments have been really motivating, I will say that, and have definitely helped me. I know I haven't gone through some of them and liked them, but I still have absolutely read them, and I very much appreciate it. So, with that said, apologize for the long rant. Let's continue on to this. Today we'll have Penny Tailsup, Nightshift Ruminations, and Mack's Paranormal in today's video as well. Now, next weekend they will not be in here, for the people who like just hearing me, as well. So I'm trying to work things in and out of videos. Alright. Now officially rant over. Let's begin. So, with that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares. A horrible curse befell my girlfriend, and now she can only eat human meat, and I'm her personal butcher. It all started 2 years ago when my girlfriend became very ill and struggled to eat. Anything she did eat would usually come back up a few minutes later. At first, the doctors weren't sure what was wrong with her, theorizing it may be a stomach ulcer, but after her health continued to deteriorate further, tests revealed that it wasn't stomach ulcers, but instead stomach cancer. This news shattered our world. Never in a million years could we have guessed it would be cancer. Elaine was just in her mid-20s, and I know that doesn't make you immune, but it sure makes you feel that way. The cancer was caught pretty late, and neither of us had a lot of money, essentially living paycheck to paycheck, so our medical options weren't that great. We live in Buffalo, meaning we were just 30 minutes too far south for good and affordable medical care, and with Elaine unable to work, I made the choice to take on a second job as a nightly garbage collector. It didn't pay great, but beggars can't be choosers. It was at this job, however, that I met Eli Carson. Eli was a wild dude, but was only 30, but looked easily mid-40s. He had a shaven head with a singular rat's tail hanging out the back. His eyes were dark green, and his face had a long, thick scar going from his right eyebrow down across the bridge of his nose right down to his left cheek. The craziest thing about him, though, is that he grew up in a cult, a sort of offshoot of the unification movement cult, set up by more eccentric members. He told me he had been a member from birth and lived on a commune until he was 19, until he had escaped. The stories he had from the cult made the night shift go by much quicker, but it was once I told him about Elaine's situation that the funny stories turned serious. Due to his cult links, Eli knew some pretty weird and out there people, and he put me onto someone who he had said could cure Elaine 100%. Her name was Madame Arachnia. Eli described her as the craziest mix of genius and psycho I've ever met. He said that she worshipped eldritch gods, and that she believed H.P. Lovecraft was not a fiction writer, but instead a prophet. However, he promised me that no matter how insane her beliefs were, that nobody else was better equipped to help. I got shot one night while out on a date, and I was set to be on crutches for 6 months, but she had me walking in no time, he claimed, though I doubt the veracity of the claim. However, Elaine was quickly running out of options, and I couldn't live with myself if we didn't try everything we could. So, what if it turned out to be a hoax? It wouldn't change anything about our current situation, that's for sure. Madame Arachnia worked out of a camp deep in a forest at Niagara Gorge. The camp was designed to look like a circus, including a big top tent. Fairy lights hung up all over the camp, connecting the multiple tents and teepees that were dispersed throughout. Up in the left corner, just beside the big top, was an animal pen that contained some sheep, goats, cows, and horses. Madame Arachnia's tent was situated at the back of the camp, guarded by 2 tall men dressed like jesters. However, instead of the usual colorful attire, they wore all black. They wore a skull mask and a vest made of bones, as well as coal-black jesters' hats with little skull bells that jingled as they walked. Both men carried 4 black balloons and 1 white balloon. They led me into the tent, which unsurprisingly was illuminated by multiple fairy lights draped across the roof. There was a strong smell of burning sage and lavender incense, and the floor was covered in hay that crunched whenever someone took a step. I had assumed that Madame Arachnia would be an old lady covered in warts, though that turned out to be very wrong. When she pulled down her shawl, she revealed a stunningly beautiful woman with a pale, freckled face, bright yellow eyes, and a tattoo of a black widow spider around her right eye. The sides of her head were shaved, with the jet black hair on top done into a quiff, with a white streak dyed into it. Each one of her fingers wore a golden covering coated with encrusted gems, and she had the letters H and P tattooed on the back of her left and right hands, respectively.
Samuel, I'm guessing,
she said, while pulling off her shawl as I approached, her yellow eyes staring directly into mine, as if she was trying to gawk into my soul.
That's me, though most people call me Sam,
I responded, while pulling out the wicker chair from under the table so that I could take a seat.
Well, Sam, I understand your dear Elaine has been attacked by a horrible disease,
she replied, as she picked a small satin black sack off the floor and placed it on the table, the glass contents rattling around inside as she did.
Yeah, stomach cancer. We've tried everything that we can afford, but nothing's worked, and I don't know how long she has left,
I explained, while biting my lip. I found it hard to discuss these matters with anyone without bursting into tears. Madame sat in silence with her fingers crossed for a few seconds to allow me to regain my composure. Once I did, she continued on.
Cancer is a horrible thing. To me, it is the greatest evil in our universe. It turns our body against us and kills us slowly from the inside. A truly reprehensible disease. People beg their god to cure them, but more often than not, neither their god nor their doctor can do anything for them,
she replied, as she put her hand into the sack and began to rummage around inside.
However, the old ones would never allow a servant to die such a horrible death.
After rummaging around for a bit, she eventually pulled out a glass vial with a cardboard cork at the top. The vial was full of a crimson-red substance that swirled around in the glass. Madame Arachnia placed the vial into my hand, then with her hand she closed mine over the vial. She held my hand in between both of hers and looked at me in the eye again.
I made this concoction especially for your Elaine. She should drink this as soon as possible, then rest. It'll clear all of her ailments and strengthen her stomach in no time.
I'm not sure if it was her confidence or my desire to want her to be correct, or maybe a mix of both, but at that moment, I completely believed Madame Arachnia. This was going to work.
Thank you. So much. What do I owe you?
I asked her, as I pulled an envelope out of my jacket which contained $3,000, my entire savings.
Oh, monetary gain means little to me. Elaine's return to health will be of use to my gods. Appeasing them means much more to me than any piece of paper assigned an arbitrary value.
Madame Arachnia replied, as she lifted her hand up and gestured for me to put the money away. There had been many red flags from my trip to the camp, but this should have been the biggest. Nobody does anything for free. Whether they take money or not, in some way, they expect to be rewarded for what they have done. However, at the time, I didn't think about that. I just thought Madame was just some saint doing good acts in the name of some misplaced belief in fictional gods. How wrong I turned out to be. The first 4 days after Elaine had taken the potion were no different than usual, and I started to believe we had fallen for a stupid hoax. I was angry at myself for falling for such an obvious fake cure, and I was even angrier for having to put Elaine through the more stress, getting her hopes up again for nothing. On the 5th day, though, things changed for the better. Elaine woke up and seemed to be doing much better than before. The color had come back to her face, and she was full of energy again. Her beautiful smile touched each one of her rosy red cheeks in the morning when she woke me up to tell me how amazing she felt. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw how great she looked. If it weren't for the weight loss, you wouldn't have believed that she was a cancer patient. However, the good feelings didn't last, as she immediately threw up when she ate some toast that I had made for her. We were both shocked when she threw up, and I could tell how much effort Elaine was putting into stopping herself from exploding into tears. It had seemed that we had found a cure, but after she threw up, it became apparent it had only been a placebo, except it wasn't. We decided to go to the doctor for a checkup, hoping for the potion may have fought back some of the cancer. Not enough to return Elaine's appetite, but enough to give her back some energy and to give us a fighting chance. However, when the test results came back, the doctors were dumbfounded. The cancer was completely gone. There was no trace at all. The doctors couldn't believe their eyes. Elaine sat in silent shock upon hearing the news, only coming out of it when I threw my arms over her.
I'm alive,
she said, before beginning to cry as I held her tight in my arms. The doctors informed us that Elaine's throwing up when eating was most likely her body getting used to regular food again, and that it would soon return again. They told us to ensure that she only ate small portions and soup for the time being, which is all she could really usually stomach when she was sick. However, over the next few days, she couldn't even stomach that. 4 days had passed since she got the all clear, and she couldn't even eat some toast and soup. The rest of her body had been cured, but it seemed like her stomach had been deteriorated. I decided I needed to meet with Madame Arachnia again. If anyone had the answers, she would. I just wished it wasn't the answer she gave me. When I reached the camp, I was once again greeted by the creepy jesters who walked me into Madame's tent once more. I explained to her that the potion had worked, but Elaine couldn't eat no matter what we tried. Her response to this took my own appetite away from me.
Well, of course she can't eat. You weren't feeding her the right meat,
she said, as she placed some tarot cards face down on the table, keeping her eyes focused on them as she spoke to me.
Well, you never told me that there was food she couldn't eat. What can't she eat?
I replied, expecting to get an answer like horse or rat. However, the answer was much, much worse.
Humans,
she replied, as she lifted her head to finally look at me and grin. My heart sank into my stomach upon hearing this, and I began to sweat profusely before lashing out in anger.
Don't joke with me!
I screamed, as I jumped up from my seat and lashed a closed fist against the table, causing the tarot cards to fly off the table and onto the floor. Both of the jesters took a step forward, preparing to attack me, but Madame ordered them to step back before beckoning for me to retake my seat.
sit down and relax, Sam. I am not joking. My potions aren't a miracle. They cure, but they need something in return. In this case, Elaine's stomach has been modified to fight off all infections and diseases, but in return, she can only eat her fellow humans.
She explained, as she reached her right hand out and called for one of the jesters, who then carried over a lunchbox and placed it on the table, opening it up to reveal a liver.
This is a human liver. Take it home and cook it for about 6 minutes on each side, then serve it. It'll be the tastiest meal Elaine has ever had. And once she has a taste for human meat, She'll never want to go back. Not that she has a choice.
Arachnia said, before starting to chuckle as she placed the top back of the box and slid it across the table to me. The anger I felt before quadrupled as I sat there being mocked. However, I took a few deep breaths and composed myself, knowing that Madam's two goons might not be held back by her a second time if I lost it again.
And how do I know this is a human liver? This could easily just be a liver from one of your animals. I want you to stop playing around with me and give me a proper answer. Stop this frustrating joke, please.
I calmly replied, as I sat back in my seat and crossed my arms. Madam didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned her head to look at the gesture to the left of her and nodded to him. Once she did, he walked away to the back of the tent, coming back a moment later with a plastic bag slung over his shoulder. He walked up to the table and dropped the bag directly onto it. The full weight of the bag hit the tabletop with a loud thud before a head rolled out from it, a human head. Once the head rolled out, I leapt from my seat and screamed before the gesture put both hands on my shoulder and forced me back down into the chair.
Sit now.
With a hoarse voice.
We don't do jokes around here, Samuel. If I say something, I mean it.
Madame Arachnia said with a serious tone, though I was no longer looking at her. My eyes were transfixed on the detached head sitting on the table in front of me. The head looked to have belonged to an older man in either his 40s or 50s, going off of his wrinkled face and long gray hair, with some spots of bald dispersed throughout. His facial expression was one of immense pain, and his eyes had been gouged out. I started to wonder what this man had done to earn such a fate, but that mattered very little to me at that moment. What did matter, however, was how dangerous Madame Arachnia was. My right leg twitched uncontrollably underneath the table as she spoke, fearing that I may face the same fate as this man.
Now take that lunchbox, leave this camp, and never dare return. The boys will see you out.
Madame Arachnia said, as the gestures approached me and lifted me out of the chair. One of them handed me the lunchbox before both walked me out of the camp and back to civilization. When I got home, I cooked the liver just as Madame had told me to, and just as she predicted, Elaine loved it, but more importantly, she was able to keep it down. I waited until the next day to see if she was able to keep it all down before sitting her down and explaining to her what she had consumed, a man's liver. At first, she thought it was a joke, but once more, I assured her it wasn't. She understandably slapped me across the face, then stormed off, leaving me alone with a deep red hand-shaped mark on my face. She didn't return until later that night, but when she did, she was much calmer than when she left. It was that night that we accepted we only had two choices going forward. We could either do what needed to be done, or allow Elaine to starve. The latter was never an option, and there was no plan B. So, it was obvious that we would need to kill to keep Elaine alive. I said that I would do it as I had gotten us into this mess. We are, or I should say, we both were pretty non-violent people, so just jumping straight into murdering people wasn't so easy. We knew we couldn't just kill anyone. Elaine decided that we would choose certain people, people who deserved to die. So, that explains why I'm sitting in a parking lot across from a 24-hour gym at 1 a.m., waiting for the right person to leave. The right person was Jack Werther, a 33-year-old man and fitness aficionado. He needed to keep himself in top shape to impress the ladies, but when I say ladies, I should really say girls, young girls. Jack usually likes them between 13 and 16, and he was into some pretty weird stuff. I know this because Jack has been texting back and forth with Elaine for the past 3 months, though he thinks she's a 14-year-old girl. I've done this a few times now, so you might assume I was getting used to it, but if I'm being honest, I dread doing this every time. I struggle to sleep for days once I notice that meat is running low, though I thankfully don't have to do this too often. A whole human lasts pretty long, but not as long as you'd hope, since it's all Elaine can eat. Most of the body can be used bar the head, hands, and feet, which she struggles to eat except the eyes, which she enjoys blended up like a smoothie. I had wished Elaine would have picked a weaker, less fitness-loving meal, but we take what we can get, and it's hard to survive multiple shots to the head from a hammer, no matter how strong and fit you are. I had to sit and wait for Jack for over 2 hours. During that time, my usual feelings of fear, anxiousness, and paranoia subsided as I tried to focus on even staying awake. However, Jack eventually left the gym and briskly walked up the quiet, empty street and into the darkness. Once I saw him leave, I grabbed the hammer out of my bag and followed after him. Time for dinner. I glanced at my watch as I entered the dining area through a side door. The hall was for the main in shadow. Stacked tables and chairs lined the walls. I could just make out a raised stage at the far end. I eventually found the twin doors to the kitchen partially obscured by 2 lockers. I stood for a moment, braced myself, and then pushed them open. A wave of hot air hit me like a sauna. I blinked as my eyes were immediately drawn to an industrial-sized electric pot. It stood in a corner, wedged between 2 steel counters, one of which was strewn with unlabeled tins. Something was already simmering in the oversized metal container, giving off a pungent odor. A large extractor fine-labeled overhead. Madge, the head dinner lady, stood backing me, bent over the bubbling pot. Even from behind, I recognized her from my interview the weeks prior. She was stirring the contents, her sleeves pulled up to her elbows. Must be hell on the back, I thought, as I wiped a trickle of sweat from my brow. She yelled orders over her shoulder to the staff as she grabbed a tin, sniffed it, wrinkled her nose, and threw the contents into the large pot. I noticed one woman cut fat and gristle off large chunks of meat. She took the scraps over to Madge, whom, without even looking, swept the contents from the chopping board into the pot and continued stirring. There was something about Madge's cavalier attitude that was directly off-putting. I hadn't liked her during my interview, and I liked her even less now. The interview the previous week had gone well. Madge had ushered me into her small, cramped office. Right off the bat, she had informed me, with some pride, that her title was now head chef, and I should refer to her as such. The term dinner lady was outdated and demeaning. I was to refer to myself and my colleagues as lunchtime supervisors. She rattled on about how most of the food was cooked on site, ingredients sourced and provided by the best farms all over the UK, and of the highest quality. My shift was from 12 to noon. She informed me that my main duties would be cooking, serving the kids their lunch, and helping to clear up. All things being equal, I should be out by 2:30 p.m. on the weekdays, apart from Wednesdays when she might require me to stay back and help with the stock check. I nodded. Madge was a hulking brute of a woman. Her huge, short arms lay on top of her mammoth chest, as if it were a shelf. At one point, she tried to clasp her fingers together. She let out a loud gasp, inhaled deeply, coughed, and decided not to asphyxiate herself. I continued to study her as she bent forward, flicking through my application form. A soft wheeze escaped her with each breath. I watched, fascinated, as her clownish, thick, penciled eyebrows disappeared into her bleach-blonde hairline that was tied back into a tight bun. Deep ridges furrowed her brow, as contradictory laugh lines feathered the sides of her tiny, heavily made-up eyes. Her cheeks and nose were very veiny and red, probably due to too much alcohol. Her voice rough and raspy with a hard edge. A slash of red lipstick across her thin, mean mouth completed the picture. She looked like something that had just stepped out of an 18th century kitchen or a nightmarish fairy tale. They say by the time you are 50, you are gifted with a face you deserve. I would bet my last penny Madge was a very unpleasant person overall. She must have sensed my scrutiny, because she suddenly stopped talking and looked up at me. We sat in silence for a minute.
Well,
she said.
Do you have any questions?
No. I think you explained everything. She grunted and stared down at my resume. I let out a sigh of relief as she handed me a set of keys.
Key to the side gate. Don't use the main gate. That's for parents, kids, and teaching staff. Keys to the dining hall and kitchen.
She jabbed at each key in turn.
See you on Monday.
She shuffled her papers. I stood and thanked her as she turned away. Don't be late, she barked after me. I glanced at my watch again. I was just on time. A sweaty Madge bustled up to me. You won't be cooking, just serving today, she informed me. She wiped her hands on her apron.
Coming through.
I dodged out of the way as a woman came sailing past with a massive tray. My back prickled with the heat that belched from various stoves. I counted 6 women dressed in aprons and hairnets. They baked, boiled, and fried, generally cooking up a storm. None of them spoke, none of them smiled. Their faces were slack, devoid of emotion, their actions precise and practiced. The speed at which they worked was impressive, a well-oiled machine, and I hoped I wasn't to be on that one wonky cog. The large metal center table was laden down with fresh produce, which the woman soon dispersed among the many pots, pans, and ovens. The counters were fast filling up with dishes of all descriptions. A woman twice the size of Madge, with bright red hair, nudged me aside as she popped a stool in front of Madge and gave her a hand up. Madge clapped her hands together, ordering the staff to gather round for an impromptu meeting. She didn't bother introducing me to the rest of the team, which was rather rude in my opinion. It was as if I didn't matter at all. The small group of women looked up at her as she barked instructions about what to serve and what not to serve, how much and how little. Her sidekick and second-in-command, Clara, looked us over as if she was a sergeant major. She was even meaner looking than Madge. Her shockingly bright red hair swept back in a bun similar to number 1, only tighter. She stood behind Madge, arms crossed. I looked around at my colleagues. I couldn't believe I was a part of this fat and miserable army, and prayed I wasn't there long enough to acquire an iota of their ample proportions. Even the younger ones were overweight and miserable looking as well. After the lengthy meeting, a hairnet, a pair of rubber gloves, and an apron that was 3 sizes too big, they were shoved at me. A frenzy of activity ensued as the staff rushed to place mountains of food onto the center table. Seats were pulled out, and the woman sat down. I was ushered to a seat by a young woman as well. I hadn't noticed her before, probably because she was so tiny and hidden behind the bulk of our colleagues. She sat down next to me.
Just eat everything they give you,
she whispered.
I don't like it when you don't eat.
Why? The girl shrugged nervously and took the plate offered her by Clara. I stared down at the food I'd been served. The plate wasn't very large, but the amount of food piled onto it was ridiculous. I looked around me as the other women tucked in. No one spoke except Clara and Madge, who stuffed their faces while laughing and gossiping, not really caring who heard. The rest of the women ate in sullen silence.
You'll have to do better than that,
Madge rasped in my ear. She looked down at my barely touched food with a disapproving eye.
We don't waste food, you will find, madam.
I nodded, embarrassed. She swept the plate away, giving me a dirty look as she threw the contents into the bin, muttering something about uppity students. The shutters to the children's dining room were opened, and I watched as dozens of kids filled into the dining area, took a plate from a side table, and timidly approached the counter. Madge had transferred some of the contents from the industrial pot into 2 smaller ones with wheels. Clara wheeled one of the pots towards the serving counter. She yelled at me to serve the stew, while Madge elbowed the young women who had spoken to me during lunch.
Oi, Angie, don't just stand there. Serve the veg.
I glanced over my shoulder as the woman rolled trolleys laden with roast chickens, potatoes, carrots, gravy, and hams into the dining hall. I watched as they wheeled the feast past the kids over to the stage where the teaching staff were seated. The headmistress sat in the middle, beaming down on the proceedings like a magnanimous demigod. I raised an eyebrow and stared down into the murky contents of the pot designated for the children. I took the little boy's plate and stirred the stew with the large ladle. It smelt awful. I scrunched my nose and looked apologetically at the tiny boy as I scooped up some slop. I gulped as a piece of something plopped into the middle of his plate. It looked like meat. The little boy blinked a couple of times and thanked me. Angie stood next to me while serving pale-looking string beans. Clara finished the meal off with some lumpy mash, which she smashed down onto the little boy's plate. An involuntary "Hey!" escaped my lips. Annie nudged me and coughed. I gulped back the rest of my sentence, and I was fuming. The heifer had almost knocked the plate out of the poor kid's hands. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of dislike for Clara and Madge came over me. I squeezed the serving spoon tight and held my tongue. Over the next hour, I served the slop and chatted to the kids, asked them how they were and if they liked their lunch. Madge pulled me aside after my shift was over and advised me in no uncertain terms that they didn't talk to the brats. They fed them, and that was it. I was horrified and almost in tears as I sat in my car outside the school. First off, Oliver Twist would have turned his nose up in that mess they called food. Second, the way they treated the children, you wouldn't treat any animal that way. And third, I wasn't stupid. I noticed all the fresh produce available. Surely, they couldn't have produced that disgusting slop with such wonderful fresh ingredients at their disposal. I spied Ange leaving through the side gate and honked at her. She turned and scuttled towards me, throwing furtive glances over her shoulder. I wound down my window.
Would you like a lift?
She nodded and got in quickly beside me. She only spoke to me to tell her address and to thank me when she hopped out. I wanted to, but dared not question her. I wasn't sure she would run back to Madge and report me. I found it hard to go in the next day. I tossed and turned all night, even if the food was up to standard. That didn't give them the right to treat the children like they were second-class citizens. The food we and the teachers had been served had smelled and looked delicious, a far cry from what the kids were being served. Maybe it was an off day. I comforted myself. It turned out it wasn't an off day. It was very much an everyday thing. The delicious fresh ingredients went to the making food for the teaching and kitchen staff. The children's food at times left over fat, offal, and bones thrown into the pot with cheap cuts of meat and substandard produce from God knows where. I wasn't sure what was in the unlabeled tins, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Over the next few days, it was hard to ignore the kitchen staff siphoning food away into duffel bags, large laundry bags, and boots of cars. I was encouraged to take whatever I wanted, but I refused politely. Ange opened up a bit more to me as I dropped her off after our shifts. She told me Madge and Clara had been leading the kitchen for the better part of 20 years, and what they said was law. I had noticed that they had bullied and coerced the staff to overeat, reducing some to tears, but surprisingly, no one spoke up or reported their treatment. It was a toxic environment, and anyone who might be inclined to feel a tad sorry for the dinner ladies under Madge's ministrations, only they were just as mean to the kids. Particularly so after Madge or Clara would give them an earful. Powerless in the face of their bosses, they took their distress out on the children. I didn't notice any compunction when it came to stealing either. By my second week, I had had enough. The staff's absolute scorn and dislike for the children, coupled with the unrelenting theft and disgusting slop they served the kids, was beyond me. The first week, they had pretty much left me alone with regards to siphoning and stuffing my face. Into my second week, and the pressure was on. I finished my shift on the Tuesday, dropped Ange off, got home and had a shower, scrubbing off the stink from that disgusting bubbling cauldron of shit. I couldn't be a part of this. No matter how much I needed the money, I had made up my mind. I was gonna quit. I decided to leave a message that I wouldn't be returning. I would drop off the keys at some prearranged time. I groaned as I dug around in my bag. My phone. I must have left it at the school, but where? I looked at my watch. It was after 7 p.m. I winced as I remembered a clatter on the floor. Just when we had finished our decadent lunch, Clara had shoved me towards the serving counter. I didn't have time to check if I had dropped anything. I grabbed my car keys. I figured those troglodytes would have gone home by now. I'd sneak in, grab my phone, and drop off the keys at the same time. It would save me having to go back and face that absolute moose, Madge. I didn't really care if they paid me or not. I would survive. I pulled up a few doors from the school and sat watching for a time. Eventually, when sure it was all clear, I snuck in through the side gate. I noticed the dining area door was unlocked. Not thinking much of it, I walked through the softly lit dining area. I stopped as Clara and Madge's loud, raucous voices drifted from the kitchen. I tiptoed to the door and peered in through the small, fogged-over window. They were both standing by the far counter next to the industrial pot, throwing ingredients in. What the hell were they still doing here, cooking at this hour? I saw Clara place a cardboard box on the counter. She opened the flaps and Madge took a peek. They looked at each other and giggled. I craned my neck and spied my phone under the table. I looked back at the women. Then, I heard Clara tell Madge she was going to pop down and off license and get them some beers. I scarpered and ducked down between the two lockers situated close to the kitchen door. Her heavy footsteps echoed eerily through the hall as she passed me by, oblivious to my presence. Then, the outer door slammed shut. I counted to 10 and then slipped into the kitchen. Madge was humming to herself, doing something with the box. I kept my eyes trained on her broad back as I reached the center table. I glanced back at Madge, then froze. I squinted and then blinked rapidly. Madge had reached in and pulled something out of the box. I wasn't quite sure what I was seeing. From the looks of it, it was a very dead cat. I gasped. Madge spun around, still holding the dead animal. Her eyes narrowed.
"What do you want?"
She growled. She didn't attempt to hide or conceal the animal. She laughed as she followed my eyes.
"Oh, screw off, love. It's just a cat and it's fresh dyed this morning."
What the hell are you doing? I asked, afraid of her answer, hoping it wasn't what I thought it was.
"What do you think I'm doing?"
You're not serving cat to the children. You'll make them sick, I said in a weak voice. She seemed shocked at the suggestion. Her cheeks turned a deeper hue of red, her eyes popping.
"I'll have you know that I am the best at what I do. Everything I cook is of the best standard."
She turned back to the counter.
"They've been eating all sorts for years, and not one sick brat. Not from my food."
You're insane, I yelled at her. She seemed taken aback. I'm calling the police.
"Yeah, go ahead. What do you think you've been serving the kids then?"
She looked at me, her fat hand on her fat hip, and she threw back her fat head and laughed as I slowly approached her.
"All of you here will be implicated. Every last sodden one of you, even to Fancy Pants."
She poked her pudgy finger at the ceiling. I assumed she was referring to the headmistress.
"Yeah, that's right. Her, who has been sitting in her fancy office siphoning thousands of pounds from the food budget for years. So go ahead."
She wheezed. You've been serving the kids this? She nodded in the direction of the simmering, bubbling pot.
"Stealing and eating the kickbacks, so fuck off."
She lifted the cleaver. I grabbed her hand. She shoved me away with a flick of her gargantuan hip. I went flying, landing heavily on my shoulder. I stared in horror as she slapped the dead cat into the counter and brought the cleaver down. I winced at the resounding crunch as it severed bone and sinew. The head flew off the table. I yelped as it landed next to mine. She threw back her head and laughed at my reaction.
"For hell's sakes, loads of people eat cats, dogs, and rats all over the bleeding world. Get over yourself,"
she muttered as she began to skin the animal. I heaved as she gutted it and threw it whole into the boiling liquid. You've lost your mind, I yelled at her. She moved between the counter and pot, throwing in manky-looking vegetables and potatoes. I thought of the children as I staggered to my feet and launched myself at her. She spun to confront me, faster than I would have ever given her credit for. I heard a snap as one of her heels gave way. She made swimming motions as she staggered, her eyes bugging in fright, as she toppled backwards into the biggest pot in Britain. I remember her bragging. She screamed, and with a massive splash, her head and upper body disappeared into the massive industrial pot. Her legs kicking, thrashed, then bicycled into the air. Jesus Christ! I screamed, as an explosion of liquid flew from the pot. Madge's arms appeared and flapped, beating at the hot liquid. Then, reaching up into the heavens, as if begging for intervention, but like a drowning woman, she came away with nothing. Meat and other things slipped from her arms back into the pot. I wasn't sure if those were bits of meat she had already thrown in, or skin coming away from her blistering flesh. She continued to grasp at thin air. Her hands spasmed and grabbed the sides of the pot, then quickly retracted back into the bubbling water. Stew spilled and slopped over the sides onto the once pristine floor, her pride and joy. All I could do was to scamper out of the way of the boiling hot liquid. As the thrashing and flailing legs began to beat a rhythm on the side of the pot, I covered my ears as it increased in intensity and seemed to go on forever. Thunk, thunk, thunk. I sank to my knees in absolute abject terror. Large bubbles gurgled, rose, then popped, spraying droplets onto the walls and floors. The thrashing slowed and stopped, and like a gentle tide after the storm, the overflow subsided. The only sound remaining, a drip drip of stew onto the floor. I buried my face in my hands. It had all happened so quickly. I could still see the shock in her face, the unbridled fear as she toppled backwards. It continued to replay in my mind as the silence was replaced with the sound of faint tippy pops coming from the cauldron. I raised my head and slowly got to my feet. Holding onto the table for support, I craned my neck, peering into the murky depths, beyond Madge's legs, trying to blot them out. A tidal wave of stew erupted, taking me by surprise, the contents like lava rising, bubbling over the sides, as the epicenter continued to rise like a geyser. I was so terrified. It took me a minute to realize it was Madge still clinging to life, sitting bolt upright staring at me. I screamed and leapt back as her head flopped from side to side. A horrible grunting and gurgling sound came from her as the stew and bits flew in every direction. She seemed to be looking, searching for a way out of her scalding hell. I hunkered down, hiding behind the table, unable to stand, my legs turned to jelly. Big clumps of hair came away from her blistering scalp and slid down her face, plopping back into the pot. I began to cry as she continued to gurgle and choke. I sobbed in terror as the half-cooked Madge slipped back into the pot, and like the Titanic, she sank, her torso disappearing from sight with a last glunk and gurgle. I had only come back for my phone and to drop off the keys, and somehow I ended up killing the dinner lady. Who the hell kills a dinner lady? I was beside myself. I sat cross-legged, shaking, rocking backwards and forwards as Madge simmered away. Her legs were still protruding from the pot, her knees bent over the sides. They twitched a couple of times, making me yelp in fright. I struggled to stand, but my legs gave way a couple of times. My teeth chattered, and my skin felt cold and clammy. I steadied myself against a counter. Madge's skirt and apron ballooned out, covering much of the contents of the pot. I stared at her fat legs, and then I noticed the black spandex. The normality of her underwear against the ludicrous sight of her legs sticking out of the massive bubbling pot made me burst into hysterical laughter. It was like a bad comedy skit. Then I noticed the smell, and it didn't even smell half bad. In fact, much better than the slop they had been feeding the kids. I almost wet myself laughing. Eventually, the laughter turned into sobs of terror and fright, and the total mind-boggling horror of her demise. I closed my eyes, and all I could see was her face, purple, blistered, blind, swollen beyond recognition. I staggered to the sink and began to retch as I turned on the tap. I splashed cold water in my face, and my head began to clear. I also scooped water into my mouth as I was parched. I needed to call the police. I struggled to take my retrieved phone from my pocket and then stopped. I heard the doors to the dining area open and shut. I heard Clara's cheery voice call out to Madge that she had the beers and she had got a deal on a 12-pack. I snuck out under cover of Clara's screams. I left the scene of the crime. I left Madge bubbling and simmering away in the great hulking industrial pot, the biggest pot in all of Britain. I don't remember the journey home. I know I didn't sleep that night, though. I was terrified the police would turn up and arrest me. I sat in front of the TV, mostly in shock, thinking about Madge, replaying the horrible sequence of events over and over. A few times I reached for my phone. I was sure Clara had called the police. Perhaps I should turn myself in. Then I got angry, thinking how she deserved it for how she treated the kids. I hadn't killed her. It was an accident. Why complicate issues? Early the next morning, I decided to call in sick. Give me time to think. I must have turned various shades of white at the sound of Madge's gravel voice on the answering machine. I gritted my teeth and left a message in as steady a voice as I could muster. Days passed and Richwell Park Primary School was all over the news. It was shut down, pending an investigation. I was glued to the TV. I didn't even bother going into college. I was terrified and jumped every time my phone rang, or there was a knock on my door. Days later, reports of arrests. Then, reports of the school heavily misappropriating funds. The headmistress and some teaching staff were taken in for questioning. The police finally got around to me. I was shaking as I opened the door to them. They questioned me about the relationship between Madge and Clara, asked if there had been any enmity between them. I said no, and asked them why. They explained that Clara had been arrested on suspicion of murder. They advised me that they might need me for further questioning, but probably unlikely as I had not been there long enough, and they left. I was relieved, surely divine intervention, yet at the same time I was confused as to why Clara had been arrested for a murder she had clearly not committed. I called Ange, who broke down in tears. I managed to calm her down, and she explained that Clara had denied having anything to do with Madge's death. I could hardly make out what she was saying, as she sobbed into the phone.
Instead of calling the police, she had proceeded to clean up the kitchen, destroying any evidence that might have actually corroborated her claims of innocence.
And Madge? I hesitated. Why do they think they killed Madge? I asked, in as calm a voice as I could muster. Ange completely broke down at this point. It took a good 5 minutes to make sense of what she was saying. When she had calmed herself, she told me the worst of it.
Clara said she found Madge and panicked under the influence of alcohol. Clara continued to cook Marge. She says it's because she was scared. She didn't know what else to do. She hadn't even tried to get her out. Anyway, one of the cleaners saw her leaving early that morning, and I don't know. The police did a timeline or something.
But what could possibly have been Clara's motive? I asked.
The word is that the police believe that they must have had a fight over money or something, or maybe that Marge was going to blow the whole misappropriating funds thing wide open. Did you hear about that? But worse than that.
She started to sob again, and before she could have another mini meltdown, I interrupted. Go on, Ange. I need to know everything. And in that moment, I was more than thankful I had made friends with Ange. She sniffled.
And, well, she served Madge's remains to the kids over the course of 3 days. She said she didn't know what else to do.
I felt sick.
If it wasn't for Mr. Loglins, the janitor who smelled a rat, thought that something didn't smell quite right. I'm sorry. Oh my God.
She burst into tears again. It's okay, Ange. I know what you're trying to say. I comforted her.
Well, if it wasn't for him, she would probably still be serving Madge, but worse than even that.
I gulped. There's more? She sniffled again.
Yeah, there's more. In those 3 days, the kids couldn't get enough of her. The stew. They kept coming back for seconds and even thirds. They loved it.
I used to live in Florida, and during the summer, it was always horribly hot. So during the night, I'd keep my window cracked a little bit, just enough for some cool night breeze to slide in my room. I decided to stay up and play some old games on Steam. I went to bed at 3:13 a.m., as I had nothing better to do. My window is just to the right of my desk, and I have no blinds but see-through curtains that barely cover the glass. I always felt watched, no matter if I wasn't in range of the window. I kept begging my parents to install some blinds, or better, thicker curtains, but they said they'd do it next month. That was 3 months ago. Anyway, I was going to sleep, but I heard footsteps just outside my window. Then, I heard some heavy breathing, like someone ran 5 miles and was catching their breath. I was cold sweating. I had tears running down my eyes, and my parents were fast asleep. I knew I couldn't wake them as they were just at the end of the hallway, my room at the start of it. I had the cover over my entire body, head to toe, so I saw nothing but darkness and the little lights off my computer. I think that's what drew the thing outside my window. I could see a figure outside, peering from in the window. I didn't know what to do. I had no weapons or any sort of way to defend myself. I thought this was it. When I heard the window sliding open, a head popped in. I didn't know what it was, but it had dry, dead skin that looked 100 years old and wrinkled all over. It had a smile reaching from ear to ear, literally. Its skin must have been ripped from how big it was smiling. It revealed sharp, yellow teeth and had a stench of raw meat. I puked inside of my mouth. It popped its head back out, then it ran off. I quickly ran and shut the window, then locked it and covered the window with the curtains that didn't help at all. It ran back as quickly as hell and locked eyes with me. I could see its face more clearly, and it didn't have any eyes, just holes black as the void. It came up closer, and started banging hard on the window. I knew the window wouldn't hold, and I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, like an idiot, and watched as this thing would soon break through my window and eat me or something. I ran out of my room, but I wasn't quick enough. It broke through my window, grabbed my leg, and bit me hard. I screamed so loud I must have woken up the entire neighborhood. My dad came running and saw me being munched on by the midnight creature. He slammed his leg on its head, and it got pushed back from that, then ran out the window. I was in tears and was groaning for my leg being bitten down so hard. It bit me down so hard that it was down to the bone. Flesh ripped and blood splattered everywhere. My dad tied a cloth around my leg and rushed us over to the hospital. Police came a few days after, when I started to heal. They interviewed me and my dad, the usual stuff. Then, I remembered, laying in my hospital bed, that there was a serial killer cannibal on the loose. They said he broke from a foreign mental hospital for super crazies or something like that, and I think I could have become a victim if it wasn't for my dad. My parents fixed the window and installed some blinds, but thankfully, they never stayed there any longer. That was 6 years ago, and I'm going into university now. It still haunts me to this day, and he was never caught. Never keep your windows open, or you'll have one leg too. Thanks for listening, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your own story, the links for my email and subreddit will be down below. I've also created a Discord, so if you want to join that, the link will be in the description down below as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And with that said, have beautiful nightmares, and I will see you next time.